Tonight we're going to be looking at some further aspects of the yogas, and in conjunction with the 6 yogas and also the teachings on Bardo, which is actually part of the 6 yogas. So it's a little bit complex, and we just might go over time. I hope that's all right. As you can see, I'm broadcasting from an exotic forest here. How's that? Okay. Actually, let me just start with the reading of the homage. While briefly lent, this precious human body's white sail, pushed by clean intention's gentle wind, without turning back towards miserable samsaric deserts and making the error of missing this chance, try to receive virtue's jewels by crossing the waves of ocean mind to the serene continent of the triple gems, since doing this is more meaningful than anything else. So this chapter is continually referring back to our wisdom nature. And you could say when we are speaking about these transitional states, we're talking about shifting conditions which we might master through application of these yogas. These yogas also sometimes, in Tibetan, strictly speaking, they're referred to as dharmas. But we do now have sort of an established practice of saying like the 6 yogas of Naropa, the 6 yogas of Niguma, and so forth. So it's become a standard term, and it's fair enough because it does essentially operate with the concept of yoga. And that's where you could say through the practice of yoga, recognizing wisdom, then the transitional states become something that we can recognize and be liberated within. And this unveils then the dimension of liberation, which is then what we refer to when we speak about kayas. These are actually just, you could say, ways or dimensions of that wisdom. So in the context of the present study, we're then on the heading of the yoga of inner heat. Let me also right away say that I had a little bit of trouble with the text that I'm working with here, so we will probably go over time, but we probably won't reach all the way to the place that I had thought we'd reach to, but anyway, we'll see when we get there. So when we refer to the yoga of inner heat, this is what very often is called in Tibetan tummo, and many people are familiar with this. And as far as the 6 yogas go, this practice of tummo, also chandali, or in the Indian tradition, this is kind of what we refer to as the practice of kundalini. But then again, we should recognize that the view, even though the practices are similar, the view is somewhat different, or not somewhat, but it's the view of no self. So there is, you could say, a substantial difference in the way that this is approached. But the methods are similar, what we call Kundalini Yoga and Tummo. So Tummo is the practice of the second empowerment, the first being the Vasa empowerment that enables us to familiarize ourselves with this vision of deity and mandala. And hence, Tummo as a practice should then be directed towards this deity or towards wisdom, not used as a method for not becoming a vehicle for our habitual grasping. So the objective of Tummo, Chandali, is to purify what we call prana, airs, wind, chi. And we do this, we purify this through stimulating wisdom air. But this requires that we let go of these impure conceptions, which is what then the preliminary of the preliminary to the second empowerment is then the first empowerment, which is then the practice of sadhana, practice of visualization, recognition of deity and mandala. And in this practice of the first empowerment, we replace or see through the hoax of ordinary impure objects of the dualistic mind, and we acquire a vast view of wisdom. And this is, you could say, the more valid, pure perception of deity and mandala. If we don't have that foundation, the practice of Tummo just continues, or you could say perpetuates our grasping at habitual perception. It might, as a practice of yoga, might produce some temporary benefit, might even produce some powers, yet this is not these powers are not stainless wisdom phenomena. These are more karmic phenomena, and that ultimately is the cause of suffering. We would want to manifest what Rinpoche refers to immeasurable light, wisdom, Buddha fields. When we do this practice, the practitioner exhales or expels the stale karmic prana, the stale airs, and then applies the sevenfold posture. As deity, the practitioner practices the pith instructions on prana practice. Through this, the karmic winds enter the central channel, the avaduti. So one begins with exhaling 3 or 9 times the stale karmic pranas, and these pranas are based on, you could say, the patterns that have evolved on the basis of our dualistic passions. And these are essentially the karmic patterns of samsara. The practitioner applies skillful means, sitting in the Vajra posture with its 7 points. And as someone who very often summarizes these, I just want to read how Rinpoche phrases it because it's so concise. Maybe you want to sort of just take note of this. The practitioner sits in the posture of Vajrayana with the legs crossed in the indestructible position. The hands held in the gesture of equanimity, the back held straight, the shoulders spread open, the chin inclined slightly towards the neck, the tip of the tongue touching the upper palate, and the eyes gazing downward past the end of the nose. A simple, relaxed, cross-legged position can also be used. End of quote. And I would add to that also one can sit on a chair. So doing this, sitting in this posture, having expelled the stale breath, the practitioner visualizes his or her karmically connected deity, what we call the Yidam deity, sorry, with 3 channels, 5 chakras, according to what the sadhana describes. And then we apply what we call 4 methods of breathing, which is drawing in wisdom air, filling the vase or vessel of the body with this wisdom air, refining the karmic air with the wisdom air, and finally expelling residual karmic air. And then we hold the prana as rainbow light, as per the instructions. And this purifies karmic air and enables us to recognize and seize wisdom prana. So while wisdom has no substance, the central channel that the prana enters is visualized with the form, and this is something that purifies and you could say takes as a vehicle the substantialist disposition that the practitioner has. So this is also what we sometimes refer to as the completion stage with characteristics. There's some reference point in terms of these aspects of Nadi Prana. So doing this, the practitioner proceeds to practice the burning and melting of the Ah and Hung. This gives rise to the experience of the 4 kinds of rejoicing, or what we sometimes call the 4 joys. This is further enhanced by yogic exercises, Hatha Yoga, sometimes called Yantra Yoga, and this practice leads to the experiencing of the wisdom of deathlessness. So when we practice the visualization of the burning red-hot thorn-shaped flame, the ashe, we consider that it invokes the bliss of pure phenomena, the nectar of skillful means, as the white syllable hum. This is visualized as melting and dripping. So you have, depending on where you're coming from in terms of translation practices, the hum is sometimes H-A-M, sometimes it's H-A-N-G. Anyway, This process of burning and melting increases the experiences of the four kinds of rejoicings, the four joys, and this produces recognition of the four kinds of emptiness, and this enables recognition of inherent inborn wisdom. So the main practice of the Tummo is then followed also by some practices of exercises. And these obviously are teachings that need to be learned directly from a master, a yogi, someone who has you could say, the qualities of a practitioner of the second empowerment. So when one practices this, one still sustains the visualization that is part of the sadhana. And these exercises, they're known as Trulko in Tibetan. And Rinpoche here translates Trulko, which literally means sometimes machinery, but Trul has the implication of something miraculous or extraordinary, and Kor just means sort of mechanics. So he translates this as miraculous mudras. So these are exercises, and these practices then stimulate the prana in ways that unties knots in our energy channels, in the nadis, and this purifies then the patterns of our energy, our karmic obscurations. And through sustaining our commitment or our samaya to this practice, and we also practice this continual holding of the subtle aspect of our prana, and in addition we also have particular lifestyles associated with this practice, which include avoiding external heat sources, we avoid certain harmful foods, and we stay away from warm places, and so on. This actually leads then to the achievement of the deathless wisdom body. So someone who is famous for this practice is, of course, Jetsun Milarepa. But then again, many practitioners who are not famous also practice this, and this practice goes on until the present day. So this practice can be enhanced with outer or inner wisdom consort. There are great benefits and great dangers on this path. So the practice is enhanced further through the practice of the inner secret wisdom consort, you can say the recognition of the inner confidence as being inseparable from the wisdom consort realization. And when a yogi has that kind of confidence, he's no longer a horny, grasping, desperate individual looking for someone else, but actually has the, you could say, recognition of the inner partner, then the outer manifest wisdom consort then becomes of tremendous value or boon for the path. However, and there are some quotes then that highlight the value of this kind of making the desire the path. And this is when desire is joined with the equanimity of meditation. And as such, then it becomes the means for the wisdom of bliss. There's a quote here then Rinpoche comes with from what is called the Soul Wrathful Hero Tantra, which says, "For whoever has separated from desire, there is no more sin. There is nothing more fortunate than having bliss. So therefore, leaving your mind in equanimity, you must create the bliss of desire." So this is the scope of great yogis, and many masters, and that included Gyalwa Longchenpa. He warns that this path has caused many to go astray. And there's a famous teaching known as 30 Advices from the Heart, and I actually put it up in the folder that you all have access to. I added an additional folder called Reading, and in there these 30 advices are. And one of these 30 advices runs as follows: even though one thinks that one can progress on the path through relying on another's body, by receiving the descending tigli of the third initiation, many yogis deceive themselves with false practice. So therefore, sustaining the path of liberation is my heart's speech. So the advice here lies in recommending what we call the path of liberation, what is it again? The moksha marga, I guess it is, but it's the path of liberation, which is mainly focusing on the practices such as Mahamudra and Dzogchen, Mahāti, Hatha Yoga, Dzogchen, great perfection. So these kind of practices are practices that simply operate with recognizing the nature of mind. Whereas the Upaya Marga, the path of means, which we are describing here, this is what can sometimes be risky, as is being warned here. So rather than, you could say, stressing the path of means, then Longchenpa and others, they stress the value of the path of liberation. The next is the yoga of luminosity, which is the essence of the path. So all phenomena are the nature of luminosity, and the practice is to recognize this nature, especially at night before sleep, and in the morning when our sleep is light, we pray to the Guru to recognize luminosity. So all phenomena exist within luminosity. We could say that luminosity is essentially the nature of mind. There's a famous quote, mind, there is no mind. The nature of mind is luminosity. So the mind that is not deceived is naturally free from any objectification or reference point and has the qualities of luminosity. So this is, you could say, the essence of all the various paths one does. But in terms of sustaining this recognition, of course, we do this through the practice of meditation. But particularly then, we emphasize the yoga of luminosity as being in conjunction with recognizing the moment that we fall asleep, and also the just before we awake at dawn. So it's not exactly the same as the yoga of sleep. It's connected, but it's rather the moment before we actually begin to dream. So it's a very subtle moment, and without recognizing luminosity when we fall asleep, then we essentially sleep unconsciously, and then we have the dreams that arise due to karmic habits. So to capture the to capture the luminosity of to capture the luminosity, we pray then to the root teacher, inseparable from our deity, as then praying that we might recognize luminosity. So Thinley Norbu Rinpoche, he recommends sleeping in short intervals to train in recognizing luminosity. So when practicing this, then students, yogis would they'd sleep a lot during the time they train, but they'd sleep in short intervals throughout the day and throughout the night. The practice of the yoga of luminosity is then that we visualize the Guru in our heart, and we focus on this as we fall asleep. So this is just a simple technique, and Rinpoche writes, in a simple way, it's said in Precious Teachings that if one wants to recognize luminosity, one should visualize one's root Guru, inseparable with one's own awareness mind, in the center of one's heart, in the form of a stainless white sphere, in the center of which is the letter R. One focuses on this without any interfering thoughts while falling asleep. So one would sustain that experience of non-thought while focusing on the sphere in one's heart. And there are various systems according to the various sadhanas. There are specific such practices on luminosity according to one's sadhana. Signs will indicate the accomplishment of symbolic luminosity. So in the various sadhana practices, you would actually find other ways of doing this. This is just one way of describing it. And even though Rinpoche give some detail with regards to the 6 yogas here. These are not actually, you could say, enough to really engage in the practice. If one is familiar with these 6 yogas, these are actually very, you could say, sublime ways of formulating very clearly the nature of this practice. But if we're new to this, we simply just should regard this as a seed which will enable us to approach this gradually. So we shouldn't think that we can't practice it, but also this is not exactly, you could say, the instructions themselves. Even though the practice of visualizing one's teacher in one's heart and supplicating the teacher to recognize dreams and luminosity, that's something that universally is taught. But as then is indicated, and what Rinpoche indicates then, is that the various sadhana practices that exist, and they're sometimes very extensive with a lot of detail and a lot of manuals and instructions and so forth, they actually have the details for this. And also when it comes to these kind of practices, you can choose to dissolve the visualization or you can choose not to. As far as indications that the practice is succeeding, then if we have some experience of clear skies, if we have perceptions of clarity, this or dream of clear skies, this can indicate that we have some approaching realization of luminosity. Then again, if you really aspire to these practices, read again and again Rinpoche's words here and then approach a qualified lineage master who can then teach this. And this actually applies for everything in this chapter. Then again, it's very, very valuable to sow, you could say, sow the seeds for approaching and actually practically doing this. There are 4 degrees of greater capacity of luminosity practice. Luminosity itself is unchanging. Let me just pump up the light here. I hope this actually might make a difference. Luminosity itself is unchanging, but the veiling layers are gradually purifying. So there is a path in terms of progressing, and while the ground nature itself doesn't change, of course, depending on how obscured we are, there's different layers that gradually are purified. Thinley Norbu, he describes then the development of authentic luminosity experience here in the text, and how throughout the increasing deeper layers of sleep, then the various degrees of luminosity manifests. So this is the scope of great practitioners, but we want to also appreciate that regardless of what development the path undergoes, the nature of luminosity is unchanged. Longchenpa, in Natural Freedom of Mind, he compares this to the moon that appears to wax. And of course the moon doesn't actually change, but from our vantage point, it seems that there's a waxing moon. So likewise, these developments, they merely reflect purifying, increasingly subtle layers of obscuration. Accumulations and blessing are the indispensable conditions for recognizing luminosity. Path luminosity includes luminosity of dream, luminosity of meditation, and luminosity of death. These lead to fully recognizing ground luminosity, which is the luminosity of fruition. So we have then the ground luminosity, which we recognize, then there's the path luminosities, and this leads to the luminosity of fruition. We can also refer to this in terms of nature of mind. The ground is recognizing nature of mind, the path is to achieve stability in recognizing nature of mind, and this leads to unveiling nature of mind. But luminosity is an important term, and as far as the conditions for recognizing this ground luminosity goes, it applies what we saw earlier, that apart from accumulating merit, purifying obscurations, and relying on the blessing or wisdom teacher, there's not really any other way. It's not something we can think ourselves to or find our own way. This is a particularly profound path where there's tremendous shortcut that can be had, but it requires somebody that can very clearly show us the path. through the path of means, and that refers then to the yoga practices that we're talking about here, the 6 yogas, one can integrate and enhance luminous emptiness with the 4 kinds of rejoicing. Mastering the 4 stages enables us to recognize the stages of dissolution as death. So again, as far as the path goes, as we saw earlier, then this path of means, in which the integration of the 4 kinds of rejoicing, or the 4 joys, they use bliss and emptiness, we are able to gain a thorough realization of the unity of luminosity and emptiness. So luminosity is not something that can be grasped. We can't say, now I got luminosity, because the grasp, or rather the subject and object, are not 2 different things. So we're not heading towards something where we can say, here it is, I wonder if this is it. Rather, it's the mind that no longer grasps that that is recognized as luminosity. But with that recognition, then we can use then the path of means, and so we do think in terms of this practice as also purifying our prana, and also karmic obscuration. And when we know this, then just like when we recognize at the time of falling asleep, this will also enable us to recognize at the time of death, and to sustain this unchanging nature through then the dissolution of the elements. The yoga of dreams, which indicates confidence in the path. Okay, I'm going to skip Q&A because there doesn't seem to be any questions. Mind you, look, if you have any questions, just write them in the little question box there, and I'll be checking again within the next few minutes. If there are any questions, we can maybe go through them. So the yoga of dreams, which indicates confidence in the path. Karmic patterns determine the content of dreams. We need to break this with recognition and transformation of dreams. We need to remedy the conditions that prevent recognition. Recognizing and transforming dreams enable liberation in the bardos. So a dream comes from the waking experience due to the karmic wind and their habitual patterns that are laid on the alaya, or the alaya vijnana. And this actually corresponds also to what we would say in our Western understanding of dreams, that dreams reflect our conscious or subconscious impressions that are accumulated during the waking state. So as we're gradually caught by the dreams, then it's difficult to recognize that we're dreaming. We can be obscured then by what then prevents us from this recognition is that we are obscured by our energy. It can be general confusion, it can be lifestyle, strong habits, and so forth, heavy, strong habits. So to recognize dreams, we need to do something about these conditions. We need to purify energy, we need to purify confusion, practicing meditation. Also, as far as lifestyle goes, we need to cut some of the habits that we tend to get stuck in, and so forth. So once a practitioner then has that, the practitioner can transform then dreams into pure phenomena, or as Rinpoche refers to it as deity phenomena. And as such then, phenomena can be liberated at the time that we are wandering between the time of death and time of rebirth, the various bardos between the time that we passed away and the time that we're reborn. So we need to apply methods for recognition and transformation of the dreams into pure phenomena. Mere recognition is pointless. Dreams need to be transformed. So Thinley Norbu then gives here on page 166.5 through 167.2, he gives a number of specific instructions on how to pray to one's root teacher in order to recognize dreams, which in turn then leads to recognizing that we're dreaming and to transforming the dreams into pure deity phenomena. Again, it's important to understand really the term deity here, which is more, you could say, just unconfused phenomena, with, you could say, confusion dawning as wisdom. The projections that we have seen as the display, pure display. So this is all what we refer to in terms of deity, or mandala, or sacred outlook, pure perception, and so forth. So transforming the dreams then is essential, and Rinpoche describes how to effectively also achieve this with a few tricks that yogis would apply. Lying in the lion posture on the right side, as when the Buddha passed into nirvana, putting some kusha grass under one's body and under one's head according to specific instructions, and then one recognize then the dreams and also transforms the dreams. In general, intense dreams may be easier to recognize. We might recognize them while we're dreaming, and also we remember them when we're awake. If we can extract ourselves from daytime phenomena, we can recognize and transform dreams into pure deity phenomena. It's easier if we are not caught by daytime phenomena. So often teachers will say, while it's daytime, think that you're dreaming. So you just sustain that non-grasping from that attitude. Think about intense dreams where we have terror or joy. That's where the mind then could become vividly alert, and that can lead us to recognizing then that we're dreaming. If we're trapped in daytime phenomena, then also this will happen during dreaming. So we practice during the day in order to prepare ourselves for the dream, and then once we have confidence in the dream, we recognize their dream, we should proceed to transform phenomena. And then Thinley Norbu describes this in various ways. He says, when waking practice depends predominantly on the visualization of intangible pure deity phenomena, then when dreams are recognized as dreams, their forms can be transformed into infinite aspects of wisdom deity. So one thing is to sustain the recognition that all phenomena are like dreams, but particularly the yogi would recognize that this dreamlike phenomena is deity display, is pure phenomena. And so that also spills into the nighttime experience of the dreams, where the dreams equally are transformed. Waking and dreaming practice support each other, as we can see here. This practice affects how we transform the transitional states between birth and death. This provides, you could say, preliminary exercises in the for when we're passing away. So we could say that as these two, sleep and waking moments, they support each other. Waking phenomena are like a dream, and not being caught by either experience, both waking and dreaming states, they're seen as wisdom phenomena. Again, here we recognize the understanding of phenomena as illusory, as also having this pure aspect of deity. And so the yogi practitioner of sadhana would see both waking and dreaming states as the wisdom phenomena of the deity. And Rinpoche says, since dream practice develops the practitioner's ability to transform his or her phenomena, it is essentially beneficial for the passage through the transitional states of the juncture between past and future existences. So this particularly is, if we don't recognize the first two bardos at the time of dying, then as we are heading towards a rebirth, then the ability to transform dreaming phenomena will be of tremendous help. So in this bardo between birth and death, the mental body and the other four skandhas, they can be transformed into the purity of the Sambhogakaya pure realms. So overall, we can recognize luminosity, and this helps us at the time of the death. We can recognize then the luminosity so that when we have the phenomena of the bardo appearing, that we are not caught by them, and specifically then if we can transform the deity practice, if we can transform the dream, the phenomena of the dream we can transform them into deity practices, helps then when we are about to take rebirth. Okay. Then there's a question here. Is transforming dreams into pure deity phenomena then in another way expressed as non-grasping of dream phenomena? Yes, non-grasping of dream phenomena, that's, you could say, the preliminaries. And that's I mean, yes, someone who has transformed the dreams into pure deity phenomena, they don't grasp. And this becomes, this then reflects into that there's no grasping. There's no grasping neither in dream phenomena nor in waking phenomena. Yeah. Okay. Now we have the yoga of the transmission of consciousness, which is the determination of the path, or you could say it's the indicator of the quality of the path. This is what famously is known as POA, and that is where yogis, they are able to exit the body through the crown of the head, and it's quite important for the consciousness to exit that way. So we have various kinds of such POA. In fact, there's five kinds. There's first the supreme transmission into the Dharmakaya, transmission into the Sambhogakaya, transmission into the Nirmanakaya. Then there's transmission into the Pure Land based on three perceptions, and transmission assisted by a powerful sublime being. So the first three, they have to do with, you could say, profound degrees of practice with experience and realization. The latter two, they're more if the first do not work, and that's for more ordinary persons. It's the possibility of the POA, which is generally known in terms of transmitting consciousness into the heart of the Buddha at the time of death. And then finally also there's one where powerful yogis, they can actually help others if there's a strong karmic connection, and also the yogi is someone extremely powerful, then they can actually guide others to liberation. So the transmission of consciousness for the Dharmakaya, the first one, this is like someone for whom there's not really any bardo whatsoever. When they die, it's just like they fuse with the realization. It doesn't make any difference to them whatsoever. Students of the 16th Karmapa quote his last words when he was passing away. He just said, "Nothing changes." And so such a yogi is the metaphor for such practice is like a clay pot that breaks, and the inner space merging with the outer space. Nothing actually happens as far as the space goes. So nothing happens for such a yogi. For the yogis who have mastered then sadhana and the yogas of sadhana, development and completion stage, then their awareness minds becomes the Sambhogakaya pure realm. They recognize the purity of their phenomena through their having, you could say, lived and experienced and realized wisdom deity. And for such a person, then life and death is referred to as the full moon setting, and that follows by the rising sun. Also, there's not really any discontinuity. And then for those who have renunciation, who have determined practice, ability to practice with pure faith, then awareness is reborn under fortunate circumstances. And such a person has choice and is born out of out of compassion, and then as a Niyamanakai or as a tulku. And this is just like a conscientious merchant who comes home after a successful journey, wishing to share his wealth with others. So for such persons who have mastered these three, there's no need for the following two kinds of practice. Then again, they are taught here, and Rinpoche teaches them in some detail, and also this is what's very often understood. It's almost synonymous with Poa. Then people very often think of the next one actually as Poa. But that's more in sort of a popular context. That being said, it is important, and that's where then the transmission or the Poa transference of consciousness is done with the three perceptions of guest, path, and destination, where the guest is one's consciousness that's eager to depart, yearning to merge with the Buddha. The path is a central channel where the guest then travels. Consciousness is visualized as a sphere of luminous light that travels through the central channel and exits through the uppermost opening, the Brahmanical aperture. And then the destination is then the consciousness mingling within the heart of the Buddha, and that is like returning home to the pure realm. Once signs occur, then the practice, so if someone who practices this kind of, and one practices this kind of yoga, and this, by the way, is also under this, one would very often actually, just to go back to what was described before, this transference of consciousness to the three perceptions, one would train in that. I used to study with Chagdu Tuku Rinpoche in Nepal in the late 70s, and actually every night, or many nights, we would sit and simply just practice this, and we would then conclude with what Rinpoche also describes here, Amitayu's practice, long life practice. So in case that there's some sort of condition or auspicious condition that's created for one's departure, then to actually make sure that one still remains, one would conclude the practice with the Amitayu's teaching, with the Amitayu's practice, long life practice. So when signs occur, there could be various signs that might occur, like opening in the head, or if one has perception of pure perception and so forth, one would still continue the practice, praying and making offerings to one's teacher. And someone who has done this, when then this life comes to an end, one then ejects consciousness into a pure land, like powerfully shooting an arrow, and one is reborn in the Niyamanakai pure land of one's chosen deity when one proceeds to complete one's practice. So this is, in fact, also the scope of many great masters who would do exactly that. So each of these four above methods of Poa or transference, they are then practices which need to be trained in during this life. So however, which one of these four is up to the individual. The teacher will propose which one should pursue. Now the fifth method then is the possibility that a very powerful realized master yogi is able to guide the other one, guide someone, and it's so this is like a child being guided by his or her mother. So this really applies to when there's powerful yogis who can guide individuals who were not able to practice themselves. So this is like a loving mother who guides her child through the bustle of a busy town. The busy town here being samsara, the various projections and whatever experiences take place in the bardo. And this is then where someone like that could lead the child to the peaceful countryside of liberation. I have to remember Chögyam Trungpa's foreword to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, where he says it's not as if the guru can do anything miraculous for the student, but And I remember this really intrigued me, but Trungpa Rinpoche says he can instigate the possibility. And see, that is where our devotion then could enable such a miraculous phenomenon as the teacher actually being there to guide us. So it's not as if there's really any kind of miracle involved. It's based on causes and conditions, but with the causes and conditions of the teacher's compassion and the connection and the teacher's realization and then the devotion of the student, then something like that is then possible. Then there's the yoga of the bardos, of the transitional states, which is the joining of the path. So when we recognize display as inseparable from ground, we are free without bardos. So this is the scope of the greatest yogis. There's never any duality. Phenomena manifest, but nobody is deceived. Just like if we recognize that a dream is a dream. There's no fear, there's no attachment, there's just complete, you could say, appreciation and enjoyment of all the display. However, when we don't recognize, then we're caught by duality and we then experience the 6 bardos. These are then the 6 bardos, or the 4 bardos we discussed earlier. And the first 3 of these are the bardo at the time of death, which provides an opportunity for liberation. Then the bardo, if we don't recognize at that time, then we can still attain liberation in the bardo of what Rinpoche calls actually Rinpoche calls it, what is it again? He calls it uncontrived natural, what is it again? He uses a particular term. It's slightly unusual. Anyway, we'll come back to that. He has a particular term. I'm sorry, I should of course have it in here. Anyway, that's generally what we refer to as the Chini Bardo, the Dharmata, or the Bardo of absolute reality. And then finally there's the Bardo, and that's Rinpoche's term then, Bardo at the juncture between past and future existences. Yeah. So these 3 bardos, the time of death, what then comes next, the bardo of absolute reality, which is then where we have all the visions of the peaceful and wrathful deities, and then the bardo of the juncture, which is then when we begin to look for future rebirth, and that's why that's known as the bardo of becoming. So these 3 bardos then happen, and for the first, then someone who has recognized the nature, they are liberated without any transition. And then, yeah, so these are the 3. And so we're going to go through these 3 bardos one by one. The transitional state of dying, the bardo of the moment of death, which is when the body and mind begin to part. So this is then also known as Chike bardo in Tibetan, the bardo of the moment of death. And that's where then effectively the elements dissolve. That's prior to it, but that's leading up to it. And then eventually body and consciousness separate and we pass on. When we then separate, this is that transitional moment of death, and that is, well, it's when we begin to, it begins when we are, when the elements begin to dissolve, but they culminates then in the moment that they separate, and that is where we have the famous moment of luminosity. So for someone who is a great yogi, then they can recognize at this point when the body and mind, they separate. When we're busy with this life, death is a problem and no one can help us. So we might waste our lives and we might misuse this precious opportunity that we have with all the freedoms and advantages of a precious human rebirth. And if we do that, then dying means a lot of worry. Nihilists, meaning most of the persons in modernity, who have the view then of, you would say, the materialist view that their mind is nothing but brains or neurons, such persons will have no idea what to do. And no one can really help them, including the doctors and their families and so forth, however much all of them wish them to remain. So it applies for them and for everybody that everything is left behind, and then finally their bodies will be discarded. And that's the paradox of death, is that finally, as Thinley Norbu just says, finally the bodies they have cared for and served like gods will become garbage thrown away in a graveyard. And very often it's extraordinary how we care for and really serve our bodies like gods. The incredibly expensive food we might buy, or the sort of expensive luxuries we might lavish on ourselves, clothing, expensive spa and hotel, vacations and so on. All of that out of our attachment to the body, and that at the end just becomes garbage thrown away. We have to be confident at the time of death, like a self-assured beauty. We shouldn't dwell on the past, but focus on the Buddhas or our deity. So when we die, we have to have no regrets and no attachments. And we need to be confident that our practice is perfect, just like a vain young woman who is completely self-assured about her looks and looking into the mirror and is confident. Then likewise also we have to be confident as we die about who we are and what we are capable of as practitioners. So at that time we shouldn't dwell on what has happened in the past. It can bring about negativity which can weaken us. Instead, we should focus on the thought of the Buddhas or on one's deity, which brings confidence and energy. Also, other masters, they will give the advice to simply rejoice on what we've done well. This is not a time to begin to sort of delve into regret or second-guessing things, but simply just think, wow, I did this practice and I did that practice, I did this good and that good, and just generate really confidence and energy. There is in fact a science on when death is approaching. There's the science that go with it, and these include physical science, astrological, dream science, foreknowledge, all of these that indicate the time of the death. And you have in Tibetan, both within Tibetan medicine and also in the tantras and the teachings and so forth, then we have a lot of knowledge around this. People with no insight into consciousness think all ends with death. The gross body veils consciousness, and in the dying process the actual nature of consciousness is exposed. So it applies that most people, they assume that everything ends when they die. The science of the Vajrayana teaching is very clear on what happens when we die. The gross body is something that veils the subtle inborn wisdom, and wisdom in itself is unaffected, regardless of what happens. When the gross body dies, the skandhas no longer support the karmic energy, and that is which is then when we die. So, as Rinpoche says, wisdom has no unconsciousness. It is always awareness. So wisdom itself doesn't have this waxing and waning, but of course our recognition of it does. As far as death goes, it is the dissolution into the subtle elements then where the gross elements, presently we have the gross elements, and these then dissolve into the subtle elements. And since it's mind that permeates all these subtle and gross aspects, the mind's power becomes increasingly manifest at the time of death. And the pure elements of wisdom also become manifest, and they then reflect their potential. If consciousness is not recognized, samsara continues. If consciousness is recognized, samsara ends and one awakens to enlightenment. So if the nature of mind and the three kayas, meaning simply mind's nature and its way of displaying and operating, if that is not recognized, then samsara continues. And then we begin to recreate or re-emerge as embodiments with all the constructed by our gross karmic elements. So if this nature is recognized, then samsara ends, and there is what Rinpoche calls the directionless, timeless continuity of wisdom. The stages of dissolution at death, they're universal processes. Yeah. Actually, there's a place where Chögyam Trungpa refers to this as phenomenology. This is in Goal of, what is it again, in the Journey Without Goal, when he speaks about Vajra nature. He talks about clarity and the nature of the path, but he talks about also, he compares it to just the luminosity that happens at the time of death and the process of death. And there he actually specifically uses the word no less than 3 times. He refers to this dissolution as phenomenology. Simply just meaning that these are, you could say, individual experiences that happen to our mind, regardless of what we might think, or has nothing to do with religion or beliefs or anything. It's just stuff that happens. But these then happen, they're universal processes, and in the course of that, the 5 outer elements dissolve, followed by the dissolution then of the subtle inner elements. These dissolutions are similar to falling asleep, or also this can happen in practice. So this varies, of course. There's some descriptions on how this all happens, but it's very individual, and also different systems approach this differently. But in general, Thinley Norbu says the 5 inner elements of flesh, fluid, heat, breath, and consciousness can be understood either as dissolving into each other or as dissolving into the 5 elements of earth, water, fire, air, and space. So these dissolutions, they happen as we're falling asleep, and they might also happen when we're practicing. In fact, they probably do. So beginning with the earth element, the 5 outer elements dissolve into each other. So with the earth element, which corresponds to the flesh of our body, this dissolves into the water element, which corresponds to the fluid of the body. Then there's a feeling of heaviness. As form dissolves into sound, vision diminishes, there's an experience of mirage-like shimmering. And so on. Thinley Norbu, he, over some pages, then describes in some detail the dissolution of the elements, and we can read it in the book then, and also the signs that accompany this experience. And then finally what happens is that consciousness dissolves into space and all grasping ends. After that then, subtle dissolution begins. And this is where we then have the subtle elements, and these are then stages of 3 aspects known as phenomena, increase, and acquirement. This is really just terminology. Phenomena is when the male essence, the aspect, the male, white male essence that we have from the father, this descends into the heart. Increase is the red female essence that ascends to the heart, and acquirement is the meeting of the male and the female essences in the heart. And then there's the blackout that takes place, and this is where most people they fall unconscious. However, great yogis at that point, they sustain the experience of wisdom, and this opens into the realization of the grounded luminosity, which is then enlightenment. So this is why this is regarded as a great opportunity. So this is also when great yogis, they would remind each other. In fact, teachers or students, they can sit and remind each other of the practice as the other is passing away. There's various ways to do this. There's a very sweet story from Tugurjen's life where he is reminding his teacher, his uncle Samten Gyatso, And he's sitting reminding him of the nature of mind as something Gyatso is passing away. And then something Gyatso has passed away and his breathing has stopped and all of that. He's gone. And Tugujin then sits there and repeats and reminds him of the nature of mind. And at one point, actually, something Gyatso comes back, opens his eyes and says, "That's all right, I got it." So great yogis, they are very confident at that time. Also, one of Tongseken's Rinpoche's teachers, he wasn't very old. He's called Lama Kunga, and he wasn't particularly famous except among meditators. He was a very prominent. He was a very good student of Khenpo Gangsha Wangpo, and he passed away just outside. I think just outside the palace temple in Sikkim in Gangtok. And he was with some of his students, and as he sort of had, I don't know, a stroke or something, he just sat down on the ground and says, "I'm going to pass away now." And the students, they sort of went, "God, what should we do? Should we go get a lama or somebody?" And he just looked at them and he says, "Ha! If I can't handle this after all this life of practice, then what a waste. Don't bother." And then he just passed away, unworried. So acquirement, which is then this final stage, this is where this dissolves into luminosity, and here most black out while yogis recognize and are liberated. Thinley Norbu Rinpoche says, "The wisdom of self-awareness radiates, free from all mental activities and fabrications. Most being experience this for at least an instant. At that time, those who have recognized and have confidence to abide in the luminosity of uncontrived natural mind can instantly be liberated into Dhammakaya. All samsaric phenomena are freed into actual parinirvana." So this is the moment of awakening. So the stages of dissolution happen automatically or by themselves. The point is to sustain recognition of wisdom. So these aspects, they're described here in order to identify these stages, but it's not as if we need to particularly sort of be concerned about the details of them, because as much as we're describing them, the real point is just to settle into the wisdom. So the practitioner just stays with the recognition of pure phenomena, deity, or the recollecting the teacher, and the dissolution stages, they then happen by themselves. So the practitioner simply sustains their practice, their awareness as this happened. Awareness itself is independent from these elements and the various consciousnesses and so forth. And so ultimately the wisdom elements, they are released at the time of death, with awareness much clearer and much easier to attain accomplishment. So we say that there is an added advantage at this point, that the consciousness is much clearer. So for the practitioner who has familiarized themselves with luminosity, there is no death. Thinley Norbu Rinpoche says, so therefore for supreme practitioners there's no experience of dissolution at the time of death. They are directly enlightened in Dhammakaya without the interference of the stages of phenomena, enhancement, and acquirement. This is why one Tibetan sage has said, death is not death, but is rather enlightening for yogis. And then there's the second one, the Bardo of the Dharmata, Dharma of absolute or intrinsic reality, and this is what Rinpoche then refers to as the transitional state of the uncontrived essential nature. This just means reality itself. So for those who do not recognize during the Bardo of death, in the following state, consciousness manifests its full potential. This can be recognized in the purity. I think it's the phenomena can be recognized in the purity. Yeah, it just means that this transitional state, what happens there can be recognized in the purity of the 100 peaceful and wrathful deities. So as phenomena then display, and this is where the Tibetan Book of the Dead famously would say, don't go for the dull light that lures you into the habitual patterns of the realms of samsara, rather go for the bright light. And this is then where we recognize the brilliance of intrinsic reality or uncontrived essential nature. So this is where we recognize this purity. And it's referred to in terms of 100 peaceful and wrathful deities. We shouldn't really be concerned with the sort of the unusual, esoteric or even trippy quality of these peaceful and wrathful deities, because what essentially we're talking about, as we do with all Vajrayana phenomena of deity, is simply we're talking about the nature of our innate subjectivity as it manifests. So we shouldn't think of this as some sort of Tibetan belief, or it's again phenomenology. It's simply just what happens for everybody, but for the yogi then it is seen as pure phenomena, expression of Buddha nature, expression of basic goodness or basic sanity. Thinley Norbu just said, it is called a transitional state because mind has moved from primordial purity and the reflections of the essential nature then manifest. Unless the potential to return to primordial purity is recognized and attained through practice, its duration depends on the confidence of the individual in the recognition of mind's essential nature. So again, it's not as if one needs to focus on various practices, it's just sustaining the recognition of wisdom in which then all these phenomena are seen in their purity. So what happens is most are terrified by the content of their consciousness. Those who recognize are liberated. Caught by duality, most seek a new rebirth. So this is what happens, is that most are terrified. There's lights, there's sounds, there's all the rays and so forth. And those who have practiced meditation, who are at ease with their mind and the projections of the mind, not caught by them, and sort of comfortable with the brightness of their reality, then they are they're liberated. So the usual thing then is that those who have strong karma, there's some which have very strong karma. They go straight into their next rebirth with no transitional state. Some actually, some. That's actually evildoers. It's those who really have done evil. They have no karma. They have no bardo. And also you have those with tremendous realization. They're also freed immediately. But all others, apart from, you could say, great evildoers and great realized beings, they then experience all these manifestations of the mind, the peaceful ground manifestation of the Sambhogakaya, peaceful Sambhogakaya, and also the dynamic manifest aspect of the wrathful Sambhogakaya. And all beings, they might not see it in terms of deities as the yogi will, but they have the basic ingredients of their the mind's potential is unleashed at this point. So what happens is that beings generally are terrified, and they then begin to seek another rebirth. And so they pursue then this rebirth according to their karmic habit. Then again, even if they haven't recognized the peaceful and wrathful Sambhogakaya, if they have trained in sadhana and have some habit, then they could very well then have this the recognition that enables them to be freed in the Nirmanakaya. So for a yogi, then this experience of this transitional state of the uncontrived essential nature, what is also sometimes known as the Bardo Dhammata, is very comfortable. It's just like recognizing his or her own mother. So it's like we always have this image of a child running into its mother's lap. So when the previously recognized luminosity of a practitioner, which is what we call the luminosity of the ground, and that has then been sustained through the practice of the path, which is known as child luminosity or the path luminosity. When that experience has been sustained, then the appearances of the ground are not perceived as something else, but are just seen as the natural luminosity self-appearance. They're known as self-display or natural display, and there's no duality. And with that ending of duality at this point, that we say this is like the joining of the mother and child luminosity. And thus this bardo of Dharmata is purified in terms of the as the Sambhogakaya. We say there's liberation into the Sambhogakaya, or the five Buddha families, pure Sambhogakaya mandala. So next time we'll start then where we have, it'll be page 179, 3. And that's then the transitional state of the junction between past and future existences. And then we'll read from there until the end of the book then. Obviously, I'd recommend the introduction to the Tibetan Book of the Dead by Jigam Trungpa, Francesca Fremantle's translation from the, late mid-70s, I think, and which is really an excellent translation. And there's also a very good translation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead by Gyurman Dorje. And then there's a really profound work called The Mirror Mindfulness by Tsele Natso Rondero, and that's a translation by Eric Pema Kunzang. This is also really helpful. Questions? How are we doing for time? Gosh, I'm so sorry. The question is, what of Sogyal Rinpoche's version? Well, actually, that is not actually the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It's only that's a sort of a how do you say? The title is a bit of pun. Actually, Sogyal's book is the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. So it's much more general. It does have advice, very practical and good advice about passing away, and a lot of other really profound topics. But it's not a translation of Karma Lingpa's Tibetan Book of the Dead, what we call the Bharatudra. Okay, someone very kindly sent the long life prayer for the Tuku. Thinley Norbu Rinpoche passed away some years ago, and his Tuku was recognized. So someone kindly sent the long life prayer here. I'll just chant it in English. Om Swasti, the essence of the ocean, like long life awareness holders, is the deathless, lake-born Vajra. By your blessings, may Dungsa Jana's lotus feet firmly abide for hundreds of kalpas, bringing great waves of benefit to all beings. By this merit, may all attain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing, from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be freed. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and increase ever more and more. Thank you.